The last transmission from the missing survey team wasn't garbled. It was clear. It just wasn't in any of their voices, and it was calling them by name. Sector Verdant-9 doesn't appear on any public map of the Olympic Peninsula. It's a 14-mile wedge of old-growth rainforest fenced off after a 1976 survey team vanished. Its disappearance quietly folded into a wildfire report that no fire ever matched. In November of 1996, a 6-person element, 5 Navy SEALs and 1 attached USFS biologist, crossed the exclusion line under a Unit 0 tasking order. Their objective was simple on paper: recover a data core from a downed reconnaissance drone that had lost signal 31 hours earlier over the sector's northern ridge. The briefing back at the staging airstrip had been short on specifics. Harrington had read the tasking order twice, looking for the line that would explain why a routine drone recovery warranted a full SEAL element instead of a 2-man extraction team, and found nothing. Daniels had asked the liaison officer directly why the sector was flagged exclusion rather than restricted. The answer she got back was a shrug and a reminder that questions above her clearance weren't hers to ask twice. Team lead Jared Harrington kept the pace deliberately slow. Rain fell in a fine, constant mist that never quite qualified as a storm, turning the canopy into a green ceiling that swallowed sound almost as fast as it was made. Quinn Daniels walked point adjacent, sweeping a directional antenna toward the ridge, chasing a signal that kept flickering in and out like something was actively interfering with it rather than simply fading with distance. Cullen Browning brought up the flank, shotgun low, muttering that the silence out here felt wrong in a way Weather couldn't explain. Nobody argued with him. Elena Robles moved at the formation's edge, closer to the underbrush than to her escort. She'd requested this assignment the moment Verdant-9 came across her desk, 30 years after her uncle disappeared surveying this exact ridge, his name buried in the same file that had buried this whole sector. She hadn't told the squad that. She told them she knew the terrain. That much, at least, was true, and it was enough to get her through the gate. Nash Carrillo walked rear center, counting heads out of habit every few minutes the way he'd started doing since his daughter was born. 5 weeks old now, and he still hadn't told anyone in the squad that his risk math had quietly changed. He watched Matthews drift a half-step ahead of formation and said nothing, filing it away instead as one more small thing to correct once they were somewhere the terrain wasn't actively trying to kill morale. 2 hours in, they found the drone. It hadn't crashed by mechanical failure. Its carbon fiber housing had been peeled open like a tin can, wiring exposed and stripped with something closer to deliberate curiosity than destructive force. Harrington crouched beside it, running a gloved hand along the torn edge. "This wasn't wind," he said quietly. Daniel's thermal scope, pointed at the surrounding tree line, read a flat, uniform baseline. Nothing. Not even the rain registered a variance. That more than the wreckage made her stomach turn. Browning turned the housing over with his boot, looking for tool marks that would explain the tear pattern in any way he could log honestly. There weren't any. No blade edge, no bite radius, no chemical scoring. Just torn composite peeled back in long, deliberate strips, like something curious had wanted to see what was inside without particularly caring whether it survived the process. He didn't say what he was thinking. Nobody wanted to be first. Jacob Matthews found the tracks. 11-inch depressions in the wet loam, spaced in a stride too long for any bear, sinking deeper on the heel than any human gait would allow. He crouched over one, grinning despite himself, calling the others over like a kid who'd found something in a museum instead of a threat in the field. "Guys, you need to see this," he said, and for one unguarded second, the whole squad forgot to be afraid. Robles knelt beside the print longer than anyone else, running 2 fingers along its edge without touching the surface. The depth ratio was wrong for any known bipedal mammal in this range. Too much weight loaded onto a heel that shouldn't be bearing it at that stride length. She didn't say her uncle's field notes had described the exact same ratio 30 years earlier. She simply photographed it and moved on, jaw tight. That's when Harrington's radio crackled with Matthews' voice, from a full 20 meters behind him, back near the wreckage, where Matthews had clearly never moved. Every head snapped toward the real Jacob, standing exactly where he'd been the whole time, confused by the sudden attention. The voice on the radio kept talking, cheerful, casual, using words Matthews hadn't said. in a cadence close enough to his own that for a half-second nobody in the squad could tell which direction the actual danger was coming from. Even Matthews looked briefly unsettled to hear himself say things he hadn't. Daniels killed the radio channel entirely. That wasn't a relay glitch, she said, voice flat with the particular calm of someone refusing to panic out loud. That was a copy. Browning already had his shotgun up, sweeping the tree line in a slow arc, jaw tight. Nobody moved for almost a full minute. The rain kept falling. Somewhere above them, unseen, something exhaled a low, resonant hum that vibrated in the fillings of Harrington's teeth before fading into the canopy like it had never happened at all. Harrington called a short halt, less to rest than to force the squad's breathing back under control before anyone made a decision they'd regret. He pulled Daniels aside and asked her, quietly, whether the mimicry could be some kind of automated countermeasure left over from an old program instead of something alive. She wanted to say yes. Her instruments, still reading nothing where a voice had clearly originated, wouldn't let her lie to him. Matthew stayed unusually quiet for the next stretch of trail, replaying the sound of his own voice saying things he never said. Carrillo noticed the shift and didn't push it, just kept the younger operator inside arm's reach, a habit he'd have called overprotective on any other mission and simply called necessary on this one. Robles walked a few paces ahead of both of them, scanning canopy gaps for movement that never quite resolved into shape. By the time they reached the base of the northern ridge, the light had thinned to the flat gray of an afternoon pretending to be evening. Harrington called the squad into a tight perimeter to reassess the mission window, and for the first time since the gate, nobody argued for pushing forward faster. The forest had made its point without a single confirmed sighting, and every operator in that clearing understood exactly how effective that kind of restraint could be. They pushed north toward the ridge, formation tighter now, radio discipline reduced to hand signals only. Robles moved ahead of her escort for the first time, reading bark scars at chest height that ran in deliberate, repeating patterns. Not claw marks, she realized, but something closer to a boundary marking. This isn't random territory, she said. This is a border. We're inside it. Harrington didn't ask what that meant for the mission. He already knew. Matthews had gone quiet since the radio incident, walking a half-step closer to the group than before, his earlier eagerness replaced by something more careful. Carrillo noticed and fell in beside him without comment, letting his own steadiness stand in for words he wasn't sure how to say out loud. It was the kind of small correction Carrillo had been making his whole career, and it didn't occur to him until much later that it might have been the last one that mattered. At the ridge, they found the source of the interference. Not the drone's black box, but a second one. An older housing, corroded, half-swallowed by root growth, stamped with a designation predating any active program on record. Daniels pried it free while Carrillo kept watch, hands steady despite everything, the wedding band on its cord tapping quietly against his chest rig with every movement. Command didn't tell us there was already hardware out here, he said. Nobody answered him. Harrington ran his thumb along the corroded casing, reading a serial prefix he recognized from old unit briefings he'd been told belonged to a decommissioned program. It didn't match anything decommissioned. It matched a designation still technically active, buried 3 tiers below anything his clearance was supposed to touch. He said nothing to the squad. He photographed the housing instead, and kept walking, the first small lie of omission he'd told them since the mission began. The midpoint break came without warning. Matthew's voice again, this time from 3 directions at once, layered and slightly out of sync, calling for help in a tone precise enough to trigger every instinct the squad had trained for years to obey. Browning moved first, breaking formation toward the nearest voice, Carrillo half a step behind him shouting for him to hold position. For one horrifying second, Browning's shotgun swung toward a shifting shape in the fog that turned out to be Carrillo, finger already tightening before Harrington's hand slammed the barrel down. "It's not him," Harrington said, low and furious, more at himself than at Browning. "It was never him." Browning lowered the shotgun with hands that hadn't stopped shaking, the old guilt of a breach gone wrong rising fast and unwelcome, close enough to taste. Carrillo said nothing about how close it had been, just gripped Browning's shoulder once, hard, and moved the squad forward before either of them had time to sit with what almost happened. They regrouped at a collapsed fire lookout tower a quarter-mile east, concrete footing still intact beneath rusted steel legs, the only enclosed structure for miles. Daniels ran a final antenna sweep from the doorway and found the same flat, impossible baseline as before. No heat, no motion, nothing her equipment could confirm was out there, even as every instinct in the room insisted otherwise. She stopped trusting her own gear somewhere in that doorway, and she didn't tell anyone that either. Inside, Robles finally said what she'd been carrying since the mission brief. My uncle was on the 1976 team. His file said non-hostile territorial engagement only, do not pursue. Somebody buried that file. I need to know why we weren't told. Harrington's silence lasted a beat too long, and Robles read it correctly before he said a single word. The forest answered before anyone could explain further. A slow, building tremor moved through the tower's steel legs. Not an impact, but a rhythm, deliberate and patient, growing louder with each pass. Outside, the creek at the base of the ridge had swollen past its banks in minutes. A dam of felled timber visible upstream where nothing natural could have stacked logs that precisely. Water surged toward the tower's footing, and somewhere close enough to feel through the floor, Matthew's borrowed voice called out one more time. Pleading, desperate, pitch-perfect, right before the real Jacob Matthews, standing 3 feet from Harrington, went suddenly completely silent, his headlamp beam swinging up into the fog and finding nothing there at all. For a moment nobody breathed. The tower's steel frame kept ticking with the rhythm of that last impact, water climbing steadily up the outer footing, and every remaining member of the squad understood, without needing to say it aloud, that the mission had stopped being about a black box the instant they crossed the boundary line Robles had identified hours earlier. What came next would decide who got to leave this ridge at all. The floodwater kept climbing against the tower's footing while the 5 remaining operators pressed into the single upper room, gear piled against the door as makeshift ballast. Harrington ran a fast head count he already knew the answer to, forcing himself to say Matthew's name out loud once, clearly, for the record, before letting the squad move forward without him. Grief would have to wait for a room with a door that actually closed. He was gone before anyone registered the movement. No scream, no struggle sound loud enough to place a direction, just an absence where a person had been standing half a second earlier. Browning went to the edge of the tower platform and stopped himself with visible effort, hands shaking around his shotgun, the guilt of a prior op rising in his throat until Carrillo grabbed his shoulder and held him there. Chasing him gets you both killed, Carrillo said. We regroup. We think. Nobody said Matthew's name again for almost a full minute. Harrington keyed his radio once, twice, got nothing but static and, underneath it, something that might have been breathing or might have been the wind moving through the tower's broken windows. He forced himself to stop listening for a third attempt. Some silences, he understood now, were answers on their own. Inside the tower's single room, Daniels finally isolated what her instruments had been missing all along. Not silence, but mimicry so complete it was reading as signal noise instead of a distinct source. It's not jamming us, she said. It's answering us. It's been listening since the wreck. Harrington understood then that the drone hadn't crashed by accident at all. It had been brought down deliberately, its wiring stripped not out of aggression but out of something closer to inspection. A species studying the thing that had been sent to study it. The tower shuddered under a final, deliberate impact, steel groaning, the floor tilting enough to send loose gear sliding toward the open stairwell. A voice crackled through Harrington's dead radio channel anyway, calm and official, claiming to be an inbound extraction pilot requesting their position. Daniels grabbed his wrist before he could answer. We never had an extraction window tonight, she said. That's not a pilot. That's it again. Harrington lowered the radio slowly, understanding exactly how close he'd come to answering. Through the shattered window, CANTOR's silhouette resolved fully for the first time. 2.7 meters of shaggy, dark reddish-brown fur, shoulders filling the frame, patient rather than frenzied, standing at the tree line rather than charging. Harrington's headlamp caught its eyes for half a second and they flared a stark red-orange, nothing more than raw torchlight thrown back. No glow of their own, nothing supernatural about it, which somehow made it worse. It wasn't attacking the structure. It was waiting to see what the squad would do next. Browning raised his shotgun on reflex and Carrillo pushed the barrel down a second time that night. Quieter this time, more certain. "Look at it," Carrillo said. "It's not hunting. It's herding us toward a decision." Robles stepped toward the window before Harrington could stop her. Hands empty, voice steady in a way that startled everyone. "We're leaving your ground," she said, to the creature, to the forest, to 30 years of buried files. "We're not your enemy." CANTOR held her gaze a moment longer, the red-orange shine in its eyes vanishing the instant it turned its head half away from the beam. It didn't retreat. It simply stopped advancing, watching the remaining team with an attention that felt, unbearably, like recognition. Nobody moved until the tremor beneath the tower finally stilled and the floodwater began, gradually, to recede back toward its original banks. Harrington gave the order to withdraw south along the ridge rather than back through the drainage. The longer route, the one that kept the greatest distance from whatever territory line Robles had identified earlier. Nobody argued with the extra hour it would cost them. The walkout was silent in a way none of them had trained for. Not tactical silence, but the particular quiet of people carrying something they hadn't fully processed yet. Browning kept glancing back toward the ridge until the tree line finally swallowed it from view. Carrillo checked his radio one last time out of habit and got nothing back, which for once felt like a mercy rather than a failure. They extracted at dawn, 4 of 6, the black box secured in Daniel's pack. Matthew's name added to a casualty list that would never mention how he died. The recovered audio core, when finally decrypted back at command, carried a 1976 field log confirming exactly what Robles had said. The Grey Choir was non-hostile, territorial, documented and cleared decades earlier by a team that vanished anyway, for reasons the log never specified. Command's official brief for Operation Hollow Choir had never referenced that file. 3 days after debrief, the recovered black box was logged into evidence, then quietly reclassified as missing, its chain of custody ending at a signature nobody in the squad recognized. Harrington requested a formal review. The request was acknowledged and never scheduled. Robles requested reassignment to Sector Verdant-9 the following spring. The request was never formally denied. It was simply never answered, and by summer, her name had stopped appearing on any roster Harrington still had clearance to see. The mission ended in silence, not victory. For operators extracted, one left behind, and a decades-old file that Command still refuses to acknowledge ever existed. Somewhere in Sector Verdant-9, the Grey Choir is still listening, still answering back in voices that aren't its own, and the question of who buried that 1976 report, and why they sent a second team in blind, remains sealed above Elena Robles' clearance level. Subscribe to The World Behind Midnight to uncover the next operation before it disappears. Because some secrets are best left behind midnight.